Picture this, an entire world teetering on the edge of chaos. The year is roughly 1200 BC, and the Mediterranean, a cradle of thriving civilizations, is about to face a storm like no other. Palaces that once glittered with gold now lie in smoldering ruins. Trade routes, the lifeblood of empires, vanish overnight, and the people who called these lands home. They whisper of invaders from the sea, nameless, faceless, merciless. Who were these shadowy figures who left history scorched in their wake? This is the mystery of the Sea Peoples, a puzzle carved into crumbling stone tablets and buried beneath layers of time. For centuries, historians have grappled with one haunting question: how could so many powerful kingdoms, from the Hittites to the Mycenaeans, collapse almost simultaneously? The answer lies in fragments, an Egyptian inscription here, a shattered pottery shard there, each hinting at a force so devastating it rewrote the map of the ancient world. The Sea Peoples didn't just raid, they erased. They didn't just conquer, they vanished, leaving behind only echoes of their passage. Their story isn't just about destruction, it's about the fragility of civilization itself and how quickly the tides of history can turn. So who were these enigmatic raiders? Were they fleeing disaster, or were they its architects? Did they come from the Aegean, the Levant, or lands we've yet to discover? In this video, we'll sift through the ashes of the past, from the frantic pleas of pharaohs to the silent testimony of sunken ships. Together, we'll follow the breadcrumbs left across 3,000 years, unraveling a tale of upheaval, survival, and the enduring human spirit. Because the Sea Peoples didn't just topple empires, they forced humanity to rebuild, adapt, and remember. And that's a story worth uncovering. To understand the sheer scale of the late Bronze Age collapse, we need to step back and see the world as it was, a glittering network of interconnected kingdoms. The Hittites ruled from their Anatolian strongholds, the Mycenaeans built towering palaces in Greece, and Egypt stood as the unshakable superpower of the Nile. Trade flourished, with copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, and luxury goods crisscrossing the Mediterranean. Then, in what feels like a historical blink, it all unraveled. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The grand archives of the Hittites, filled with meticulous records, fell silent. Even Egypt, though it survived, bore deep scars from battles that pushed it to the brink. What could cause such a domino effect of destruction? Some point to prolonged droughts, as tree rings and sediment layers hint at a mega-drought stretching across the region. Others argue that internal strife, rebellions, economic inequality, or overstretched bureaucracies left these empires vulnerable. But the most striking thread in this tangled web is the Sea Peoples. Ancient texts describe them as a coalition of different groups, sweeping in from the midst of the sea with terrifying speed. The Egyptians, who documented their attacks in vivid reliefs at Medinet Habu, called them warriors without number, a force so relentless that even Ramses III had to marshal every resource to repel them. Yet the mystery deepens when we realize the Sea Peoples weren't just destroyers, they were also refugees. Some scholars believe they were displaced by the very crises that toppled the Bronze Age world, caught in a desperate cycle of migration and survival. Could they have been both victims and aggressors? The ruins of coastal cities like Ugarit tell a haunting story. A frantic letter found in its ashes, addressed to the King of Cyprus, pleads for help as enemy ships loom offshore. It's the last message ever sent from the city. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a cultural unraveling. The intricate systems of writing, art, and governance that defined the Bronze Age vanished for centuries. Greece plunged into a dark age, where even the memory of palatial frescoes and linear B-script faded. The Sea Peoples didn't just sack cities, they severed the threads of continuity, forcing humanity to reinvent itself. And that's what makes their story so chilling, not just the violence, but the void they left behind. The term Sea Peoples might sound like something out of myth, but these invaders were terrifyingly real to the civilizations they shattered. Egyptian scribes etched their arrival into temple walls, depicting ships with prowling bird-like heads and warriors clad in feathered helmets, images meant to strike fear into the hearts of future generations. What's fascinating is that the Egyptians didn't describe them as a single nation. Instead, they listed names like the Peliset, the Shekelesh, and the Denyen, groups that seem to have banded together in a loose but deadly alliance. Where did these warriors come from? The clues are scattered like broken pottery across the Mediterranean. Some scholars point to the Aegean, where the collapse of Mycenaean Greece could have sent desperate survivors sailing in search of new homes. Others argue for Anatolia, where upheavals in the Hittite Empire might have displaced entire communities. There's even a tantalizing theory linking some groups to Sardinia or Sicily, based on linguistic echoes in their names. But here's the catch: these weren't just random bands of raiders. The scale of their attacks suggests coordination, even if temporary. They moved with a precision that overwhelmed defenses, hitting coastal cities and inland strongholds almost simultaneously. What set the Sea Peoples apart wasn't just their ferocity, but their adaptability. Unlike traditional armies tied to kings or gods, they fought as mobile, self-sufficient units. Egyptian reliefs show them with ox-drawn carts carrying women and children, hinting at a people on the move, not just pillaging but migrating. This blurring of roles, raiders and refugees complicates the picture. Were they the spark that ignited the Bronze Age collapse, or were they fleeing a fire already burning? One thing is certain: their legacy is written in ash and survival. The Peliset, for instance, may have later settled along the Levantine coast, becoming the Philistines of biblical fame. Meanwhile, Egypt's victory over them at the Battle of the Delta wasn't just a military triumph, it was a desperate hold against the tide. The Sea Peoples didn't just vanish, they seeped into the cracks of history, leaving behind a question that still captivates us. How could such a force rise, reshape the world, and then dissolve into legend? The answer lies not just in their swords, but in the storms, both human and natural, that forged them. Egypt stood as the last great power, holding the line against the tide of chaos. While other kingdoms crumbled under the onslaught of the Sea Peoples, the Nile's defenders managed to weather the storm, but not without scars. The most vivid account of this struggle comes from the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, where towering reliefs immortalize the clash between order and annihilation. Here we see the Egyptian fleet, sleek and disciplined, locked in battle with an armada of unfamiliar ships, their prows carved into grotesque bird heads. The invaders wear plumed helmets and wield swords unlike anything in the pharaoh's arsenal, their chaotic formations a stark contrast to Egypt's methodical ranks. What makes these carvings so extraordinary isn't just their artistry, it's their urgency. The inscriptions speak of a kingdom pushed to its limits. Ramses boasts of repelling the invaders, but the language is telling. He calls the Sea Peoples those who came suddenly from the midst of the sea, a phrase that echoes with dread. This wasn't a routine border skirmish, it was an existential fight. The reliefs show fallen warriors tumbling into the Nile, their strange armor sinking beneath the waves, while Egyptian archers pick off stragglers from the shore. But look closer and you'll spot something unsettling: ox carts loaded with women and children trailing behind the invaders' lines. This wasn't just an army. It was a people on the move. The battles weren't confined to the water. Temple texts describe land invasions too, with the Sea Peoples and their allies sweeping down from the Levant like a wildfire. Ramses claims to have trapped them in a pincer movement near the delta, slaughtering thousands and taking countless prisoners. Yet even in victory, Egypt paid a price. The cost of mobilizing every available soldier drained the treasury. Grain reserves meant for famine relief were diverted to feed the army, and though the pharaoh's forces prevailed, the world they saved was irrevocably changed. Trade routes that once funneled gold and incense into Thebes withered. Neighboring kingdoms that had buffered Egypt from chaos were gone, leaving the Nile exposed. Perhaps the most haunting detail lies in what the Egyptians didn't record. After Ramses III, mentions of the Sea Peoples vanish from royal annals. Did they melt away, absorbed into other cultures, or had Egypt, exhausted by the fight, simply stopped keeping track? The silence speaks volumes. The pharaohs may have won the battles, but the war had already transformed the Mediterranean. The age of grand palaces and interconnected empires was over. In its place rose something rougher, leaner, a world where survival meant adaptation. And the Sea Peoples, whether as conquerors or refugees, had written the first chapter. The question of where the Sea Peoples originated is like trying to reassemble a shattered mosaic. Every fragment tells part of the story, but the full picture remains just out of reach. One prevailing theory ties them to the crumbling Mycenaean world, where drought and internal strife may have sent warriors and their families fleeing across the waves. The timing fits. Their raids coincide with the collapse of Mycenaean palaces, and some of their weaponry bears striking similarities to Greek designs. But here's the twist. The Egyptians described multiple groups under the Sea Peoples banner, suggesting this wasn't a single culture but a coalition of the desperate. Another thread leads to Anatolia, where the Hittite Empire's sudden disintegration could have unleashed a wave of displaced peoples. The names recorded by the Egyptians, like the Denyen echo terms linked to ancient regions in modern-day Turkey. Some scholars even propose these groups were mercenaries or coastal traders who turned to raiding when drought choked trade routes and famine set in. Imagine a scenario where a single bad harvest could tip entire communities from commerce to conquest. Then there's the pirate hypothesis. The Mediterranean has always been a highway for both merchants and marauders, and some researchers argue the Sea Peoples began as opportunistic bands preying on weakened empires. The lack of a clear homeland in the archaeological record might support this. They could have been a fluid network of sea raiders, growing bolder as civilizations faltered. Yet the most compelling clue might lie in their aftermath. The Peliset, one of the named groups, later settled in Canaan and became the Philistines. Their pottery and architecture show Aegean influences, hinting at a Mycenaean connection. Meanwhile, Sardinia's Nuragic culture bears weaponry resembling Sea Peoples' gear, fueling theories of a westward origin. The truth, it's likely all these theories hold fragments of the answer. The Sea Peoples may not have been a single people at all, but a perfect storm of displaced communities, opportunists, and warriors thrown together by a collapsing world. And that's what makes their story so haunting. They weren't just invaders, but a mirror reflecting the fragility of the age they helped end. The ruins of Ugarit tell a story frozen in time, one of panic and fire. Archaeologists sifting through the charred layers of this once thriving Syrian port found clay tablets mid-sentence, their cuneiform strokes jagged with haste. One, addressed to the King of Cyprus, begs for reinforcements as enemy ships loom offshore. The reply never came. The city's gates were breached, its palaces looted, and its streets strewn with arrowheads and shattered pottery. What's chilling isn't just the violence, but the abruptness. Ovens still held bread, half-eaten meals littered courtyards, proof that life here ended in a single, catastrophic moment. Shipwrecks add another layer to the mystery. Off the coast of modern-day Turkey, the Uluburun wreck lies like a time capsule from the chaos. Its cargo, gold from Egypt, amber from the Baltic, tin ingots for bronze, speaks of a connected world suddenly severed. But it's the personal items that haunt: a merchant's balance scale, a soldier's dagger, even a wooden diptych that might have held wax for urgent messages. Was this vessel fleeing the storm or caught in its path? Nearby, the Cape Gelidonia wreck reveals something darker, not trade goods but weapons. Bronze swords, spearheads, and armor piled hastily as if ready for battle. These sunken hulks suggest the sea peoples weren't just raiders. They were masters of the waves, striking with precision where empires least expected. Yet for all the destruction they left behind, their origins remain maddeningly opaque. Unlike the Egyptians or Hittites, they built no monuments, left no grand inscriptions boasting of their deeds. Their presence is etched only in absence the gaps between burned cities, the styles of pottery that abruptly change after their passing. At Tel Es Safi in Israel, believed to be the Philistine city of Gath, archaeologists uncovered homes with hearths unlike anything local, their design echoing Aegean traditions. Even their cooking pots tell a story thick, coarse wares perfect for seafaring, distinct from the delicate Canaanite ceramics they replaced. Perhaps the most tantalizing clue lies in DNA. Recent studies of bones from Philistine sites show genetic links to southern Europe, adding weight to theories of a migratory wave. But here's the rub: the sea peoples left no unified trail. Their legacy is a puzzle where every piece comes from a different box. The shattered walls of Hattusa, the Hittite capital, bear their mark. The scorched granaries of Pylos in Greece whisper of their passage. Yet their homelands, still buried beneath the sea's shifting sands or lost in the fog of time. What archaeology gives us isn't answers but echoes, and in those echoes, a reminder that some storms leave no shore untouched. The line between predator and prey blurs when we examine the sea peoples through the lens of their time. Imagine a world where the very ground beneath your feet seems to rebel, crops wither in endless drought, familiar trade routes dissolve into silence, and the safety of city walls crumbles overnight. In such chaos, survival isn't a choice between good and evil, but between adaptation and extinction. The sea peoples embody this brutal ambiguity. Egyptian reliefs depict them as fearsome warriors, yet their caravans of ox carts carried not just weapons, but families, children, elders, the trappings of entire communities on the move. This wasn't the orderly migration of settlers, it was the desperate flight of a people unmoored. Consider the Hittite Empire's sudden collapse. Grain stores in Hattusa show signs of severe shortages in the years before its fall. Could displaced Hittite subjects have joined the sea people's ranks, trading plows for swords when the land could no longer feed them? A similar story unfolds in Greece, where Mycenaean palaces burned as drought records spiked. Survivors of these collapses wouldn't have seen themselves as invaders. They were refugees with nowhere left to go, turning their desperation into a weapon. Yet the ruins they left behind tell a darker tale. At the Canaanite city of Ashkelon, archaeologists found layers of destruction filled with Philistine pottery, evidence of new inhabitants taking root atop the ashes. This pattern repeats across the Mediterranean: burn, conquer, rebuild. The sea peoples didn't just pass through, they claimed territory with a permanence that suggests more than mere desperation. Perhaps the truth lies in the middle. Like a wildfire sparked by drought, they may have been both a symptom and an accelerant of collapse, victims of a broken world who, in their struggle to survive, helped break it further. The most haunting clue comes from a single Egyptian inscription. After defeating the sea peoples, Ramses III settled some of their survivors in fortified camps along the Nile Delta. These weren't prisoners of war, but communities granted land in exchange for service as mercenaries. Even their enemies recognized their humanity beneath the helmets. It's a reminder that history rarely deals in pure villains or heroes, just people caught in currents too strong to resist. The Sea People's legacy isn't just in the cities they toppled, but in the uncomfortable mirror they hold up to us. How thin is the veneer of civilization when hunger knocks at the gate? The Mediterranean of the late Bronze Age was a world balanced on a knife's edge, rich with trade, yet perilously dependent on the whims of nature. Recent breakthroughs in climate science paint a stark picture. Tree rings from ancient Anatolian junipers show narrow, stunted growth around 1200 BC, signaling years of relentless drought. Sediment cores pulled from the seabed near Cyprus reveal layers of dust, carried by winds from parched farmlands that could no longer feed their people. This wasn't just a dry spell, it was a mega-drought spanning decades, a slow-motion disaster that turned fertile kingdoms into tinderboxes waiting for a spark. Imagine a Hittite farmer watching his wheat wither season after season, or a Mycenaean merchant staring at empty harbors where Cretan ships once docked. As harvests failed, grain stores, the lifeblood of Bronze Age cities, dwindled, prices soared, famine crept in, and when hunger gnawed at the gates, the social contract frayed. Scrolls from Ugarit speak of desperate measures. There is no food in the house. Kings who once commanded loyalty now faced revolts from starving subjects. The very foundations of these empires centralized grain distribution. Vast armies fed by surplus began to crumble under nature's weight. Here's where the Sea Peoples enter the equation. While they are often cast as ruthless invaders, climate data suggests a grimmer reality. They may have been among the first waves of climate refugees. When drought scorched the Aegean or Anatolian highlands, coastal communities would have faced an impossible choice: starve in place or take to the seas in search of survival. The ox carts trailing behind their armies, laden with families and possessions, hint at this exodus. Even their infamous raids take on new context. Attacking grain-rich Egypt or Cypriot copper ports wasn't just plunder, it was desperation made manifest. But nature's role goes deeper. Drought didn't just displace people, it shattered the intricate web of Bronze Age diplomacy. The Hittites, for instance, relied on Egyptian grain shipments to stave off famine. When Nile floods grew erratic, those lifelines snapped. Kingdoms that once traded peacefully now clashed over dwindling resources. In this light, the Sea People's invasions look less like isolated attacks and more like symptoms of a systemic collapse, where climate stress turned neighbor against neighbor. The most haunting evidence lies in the ruins themselves. At the Hittite capital of Hattusa, archaeologists found hastily abandoned grain silos, their contents left to rot, proof that even the mightiest empire couldn't outlast the drought. Meanwhile, in Greece, the palace of Nestor at Pylos burned amid records of coastal watchers spotting unknown ships, the threads connecting these events. A changing climate that pushed societies past their breaking point, and the Sea Peoples, whether as aggressors or fellow victims caught in the storm. Their story isn't just one of conquest, but of humanity's oldest struggle, to survive when the Earth itself turns hostile. The Sea Peoples didn't just overwhelm their enemies with numbers, they outmaneuvered them with cutting-edge warfare. Egyptian carvings at Medinet Habu reveal a terrifying arsenal. Long, slashing swords unlike the short, thrusting blades of traditional Bronze Age armies, lightweight armor made from layered linen or leather, and helmets crowned with bristling feathers. These weren't crude raiders, they were innovators exploiting gaps in the old world's defenses. While pharaohs relied on chariots, symbols of elite power but cumbersome on rocky terrain, the Sea Peoples fought on foot, agile and adaptable. Their weapons weren't just tools of destruction, they were harbingers of a new era where mobility and flexibility trumped sheer brute force. At sea, their tactics were even more revolutionary. The Egyptians depict their ships with high, curved prows designed not for trade, but for ramming and boarding. Unlike the heavy, cargo-laden vessels of established kingdoms, these were lean warships built for speed and shock. Reliefs show them attacking in tight formations, surrounding slower Egyptian galleys like wolves isolating prey. This wasn't random piracy, it was coordinated naval warfare centuries ahead of its time. The Sea Peoples didn't just sail to battle, they dominated the waves, striking coastal cities with surgical precision before vanishing into the horizon. But their greatest advantage might have been their lack of tradition. Bronze Age empires fought conservatively, bound by ritual and hierarchy. The Hittites glorified chariot charges, Mycenaean kings dueled in ornate armor. The Sea Peoples, unshackled by such conventions, fought to win. Their weapons were pragmatic long swords for open combat, javelins for skirmishing, axes that could cleave through bronze plate. Even their armor reflected efficiency. Layered linen cuirasses, lighter than metal but surprisingly resilient, allowed them to move swiftly under the Mediterranean sun. The irony is palpable. The very civilizations that pioneered bronze metallurgy and monumental architecture were outmatched by outsiders who weaponized simplicity. When the Sea Peoples sacked Ugarit, they didn't just burn palaces, they shattered an entire military paradigm. By the time kingdoms like Egypt adapted, borrowing their enemies' tactics and recruiting captured Sea Peoples as mercenaries, the old order was already ashes. Their legacy isn't just in the ruins they left behind, but in the undeniable truth they exposed. In war, innovation isn't just an advantage, it's survival. The Hittite Empire was the unshakable colossus of Anatolia for centuries, a realm of towering fortresses, sprawling archives, and battle-hardened chariot armies that even Egypt treated with wary respect. At its height, Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was a marvel of Bronze Age engineering, its massive stone walls studded with secret tunnels and its storerooms bursting with tribute from vassal kingdoms. Then, in what seems like historical seconds, it all ended. The city's gates were left open, its temples abandoned mid-ritual, and its grand archives, meticulous records of treaties, laws, and royal decrees, scorched into brittle clay fragments. What makes Hattusa's fall so chilling is the forensic detail left behind. Archaeologists sifting through the ruins found something startling: no signs of prolonged siege or systematic looting. Instead, the city burned fast and hot, as if its people fled in terror rather than fought to the last. Grain silos stood half full, their contents charred but untouched. Jewelry and weapons lay scattered in streets, discarded in the rush to escape. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a societal implosion, and the timing perfectly aligned with the Sea People's rampage across the Mediterranean. But the Hittites weren't merely victims of external threats. Cracks had been spreading long before the invaders arrived. A decade-long drought, evidenced by skeletal tree rings from Anatolian junipers, had choked harvests and strained the empire's intricate grain redistribution system. Letters from Hittite outposts beg for emergency shipments. There is no food in our lands. Meanwhile, rebellious vassals in places like Troy and Western Anatolia sensed weakness, chipping away at the empire's edges. The Hittites were already a wounded giant when the Sea Peoples struck, and those blows landed with catastrophic precision. The empire's death knell might have been the loss of its lifelines. Cyprus, a critical source of copper for Hittite bronze, fell to raiders around the same time. Without this metal, weapons couldn't be forged, chariots couldn't be repaired, and the army's backbone splintered. Then came the final insult. Hittite records mention enemy ships ravaging coastal cities like Yora, cutting off trade and scattering refugees inland. By the time Hattusa burned, the empire was already a skeleton. Yet the Sea People's role remains tantalizingly ambiguous. Unlike Egypt, the Hittites left no carvings of battles with feather-helmeted warriors. Some scholars argue the invaders merely exploited chaos the Hittites created themselves, like hyenas scavenging a lion's kill. Others point to a single, cryptic tablet found in Hattusa's ruins, its broken text mentioning enemies from the sea, alongside pleas for divine intervention. Whatever the truth, the aftermath was undeniable. Anatolia fractured into petty kingdoms, the Hittite language faded into obscurity, and the world forgot an empire that once rivaled Egypt. The Sea Peoples didn't just topple the Hittites, they erased them so thoroughly that their existence became myth until archaeologists began piecing together the fragments. The grand citadels of Mycenae and Turins, their cyclopean walls once thought impenetrable, now stand as skeletal reminders of a civilization's sudden unraveling. In the final days of Mycenaean Greece, clay tablets inscribed with Linear B, the earliest form of Greek record, frantic inventories, weapons stockpiled, coastal watchposts reinforced, and rations dwindling to critical levels. One such tablet from Pylos lists bronze spearheads alongside an ominous note. Watchers are stationed at the coast, as if bracing for an inevitable storm. Then silence. The palaces burned in waves of destruction so thorough that even the art of writing vanished for centuries, plunging Greece into a dark age where memory of the Trojan War faded into legend. What's striking about Mycenae's fall is the pattern. Unlike gradual declines, these citadels met violent ends within decades of each other. At Thebes, fire-scarred walls preserved traces of intense heat, while storerooms in Pylos held jars still packed with olive oil when flames consumed them. The destruction layers tell a story not of slow decay, but of simultaneous collapse, a hallmark of the Sea People's suspected path across the Mediterranean. Yet proving their direct involvement is like chasing shadows. No Mycenaean tablet names them, and their absence from Greek records fuels debate. Were they the primary destroyers, or did they exploit chaos already unleashed by drought and internal revolt? A clue might lie in the sea itself. Underwater surveys off the Peloponnese coast reveal harbors abandoned abruptly, their anchor stones left mid-use. At the site of Nicoria, once a thriving Mycenaean town, archaeologists found arrowheads embedded in doorways, some of foreign design, possibly from raiders who arrived by ship. Even more telling are the changes in pottery. After the palaces fell, styles shifted dramatically, with handmade wares replacing the fine wheel-thrown ceramics of Mycenaean workshops. This cultural rupture hints at new influences, perhaps from survivors or invaders blending with local populations. The most haunting evidence comes from the so-called ivory houses of Mycenae. Beneath the citadel's ruins, excavators found carved ivory plaques depicting warriors in boar's tusk helmets, emblems of elite Mycenaean fighters. These lay trampled under collapsed walls, as if the city's defenders fell in a last, desperate stand. Could those helmets have faced feather-crested Sea Peoples on the ramparts? We may never know for certain. What's undeniable is that Greece's Bronze Age didn't just end. It was erased, its palaces left as hollow shells where later Greeks would spin tales of a heroic past they scarcely understood. The Sea Peoples, whether as conquerors or catalysts, didn't just topple cities, they severed a thread of history, leaving later generations to puzzle over the fragments. Ugarit's ruins are a time capsule of terror, capturing the moment the Sea People's shadow fell across the Mediterranean. Walk through the rubble today, and you'll step over broken pottery still strewn where it fell 3,000 years ago. Jars of olive oil shattered in frantic flight, loom weights abandoned mid-weave, even a child's toy buried in the ash. But the most chilling finds are the clay tablets. Unlike ceremonial inscriptions or royal decrees, these are everyday messages, frozen mid-sentence by disaster. One, written by a scribe named Hammurabi, begs the king of Elashia, modern Cyprus, for help. "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. Our cities were burned, and they did evil things in our country." The reply, if it ever came, lies lost to history. Ugarit's gates were breached before the ink dried. What makes this destruction so unsettling is its precision. The city wasn't just sacked, it was erased with surgical efficiency. Archaeologists found no evidence of prolonged siege, no makeshift barricades, no stockpiled weapons. Instead, the burn layers suggest fires set simultaneously across the city, as if attackers moved with practiced coordination. Even more telling, the palace archives, usually the first target for looters, were left intact but scorched. This wasn't random violence, it was a systematic dismantling of a trade empire. Ugarit's wealth came from its role as a bridge between Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia, its docks bustling with copper from Cyprus and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. By silencing this hub, the Sea Peoples didn't just conquer a city, they severed a vital artery of Bronze Age commerce. The personal tragedies hidden in the rubble deepen the horror. In one house, a tablet lists rations for workers' dates, barley, oil with a later hand scrawling, distributed beside each entry. The final item remains unchecked. Nearby, a kiln holds unfired clay tablets, their words melted into illegibility by the heat of the attack. These aren't just artifacts, they're interrupted lives. Even the city's defenses hint at desperation. Ugarit's walls, once formidable, show hasty repairs in their final days, patches of rubble and mud brick where stone should have been. The last king, Hammurabi, likely knew his kingdom was doomed. His final messages plead not for victory, but for mercy. "My father, do not abandon me." Yet Ugarit's destruction also holds clues to the Sea People's motives. Among the wreckage, archaeologists found stacks of tin ingots, a crucial bronze ingredient still sealed in traders' warehouses. If the attackers were mere pirates, why leave such valuable loot untouched? The answer may lie in the city's strategic value. By crippling Ugarit, the Sea Peoples didn't just plunder wealth, they disabled a rival's ability to regroup. Its harbor, once a nexus of naval power, could no longer launch counterattacks. Its scribes, masters of diplomacy, would never send another plea for alliance. In silencing this city, the invaders didn't just take lives, they took memory itself, leaving behind only echoes of a world that once was. The Philistines of biblical lore, Goliath's people, were more than just villains in ancient scripture. Archaeological digs along the southern Levant coast reveal cities like Ashkelon and Gath suddenly rebuilt in a foreign style after the Bronze Age collapse. These settlements bear uncanny echoes of the Sea Peoples, pottery with spiral motifs reminiscent of Aegean designs, hearths built in the round rather than the rectangular Canaanite tradition, and even DNA evidence linking some inhabitants to southern Europe. The timeline fits perfectly. Egyptian records name the Peliset among the Sea Peoples, and by the time the biblical narrative places the Philistines in canon, their material culture aligns with what we'd expect from displaced Aegean warriors putting down roots. But the connections run deeper than pottery shards. The Bible describes the Philistines as a seafaring power with a monopoly on iron smithing, a technological edge that mirrors the Sea People's innovative weaponry. Their coastal strongholds like Gaza and Ashdod became hubs of trade and conflict, just as Ugarit had been before its fall. Even their governance hints at a foreign origin. Unlike the centralized kingdoms around them, the Philistines ruled as a loose confederation of city-states, much like the coalition-style attacks attributed to the Sea Peoples. The most striking parallel lies in their resilience. While other Sea Peoples groups fade from history after their raids, the Philistines endured for centuries, clashing with kings like David and Solomon. Yet over time they assimilated, their distinct culture blending into the Levantine tapestry. A dig at Tel-e-Safi, believed to be ancient Gath, shows this transformation in layers. Early Philistine homes with Aegean-style hearths give way to buildings indistinguishable from their Israelite neighbors. By the time Babylon's armies swept through the region, the Philistines were no longer outsiders. They were simply part of the land their ancestors had once stormed. This cultural fusion raises a provocative question. Did the Sea People's legacy shape the biblical world beyond its villains? Some scholars point to the Danites, another tribe mentioned in Judges, whose nomadic movements and seafaring exploits eerily echo the Denyen, a group named in Egyptian texts as part of the Sea People's coalition. Others note that the biblical Kafta, said to be the Philistines' homeland, may refer to Crete or Cyprus, further tying these stories to the Mediterranean's shattered Bronze Age. The truth may never be fully untangled, but one thing is clear: the shadow of the Sea Peoples lingers not just in ruins, but in the very stories civilizations told to explain their fractured world. Imagine standing on the shores of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, watching the horizon darken not with storm clouds, but with ships, hundreds of them, each carrying families, warriors, and all they owned. This wasn't just an invasion, it was a human tide sweeping across the known world. The Sea People's arrival coincides with one of history's most dramatic population movements, but the big question remains: were they the cause of this upheaval, or merely its most visible symptom? Climate data tells part of the story. Prolonged droughts had turned fertile regions like Anatolia and the Aegean into dust bowls, forcing entire communities to abandon their homes in search of survival. But migration alone doesn't explain the scale of destruction. What sets the Sea Peoples apart is how they weaponized displacement. Unlike gradual migrations, their movements were sudden and violent, hitting weakened kingdoms like a hammer. When they sacked a city like Ugarit, they didn't just take its wealth, they shattered its ability to feed refugees fleeing other collapses, creating a domino effect of desperation. Starving survivors from fallen cities would have had no choice but to join the next wave of attacks, turning migration into a self-perpetuating cycle of chaos. Archaeology reveals this pattern in haunting detail. On Cyprus, layers of ash mark the destruction of thriving port cities just before an influx of new pottery styles, evidence of strangers settling atop the ruins. In Sardinia, neuralgic towers were abandoned as their builders seemingly vanished overnight, while across the sea, the Nile Delta bristled with new fortresses to hold back the human flood. Even the language of the time echoes this tension. Hittite tablets speak of landless men swelling the ranks of mercenaries, while Egyptian inscriptions describe the Sea Peoples as countries united from the ends of the earth. These weren't isolated raiding parties, they were societies on the move, carrying their cultures like seeds to replant in foreign soil. Yet the domino theory isn't perfect. Some regions show destruction layers decades before the Sea Peoples peak, suggesting underlying instability. The Hittite Empire, for instance, was already fracturing under internal rebellions when external attacks finished it off. This raises a provocative possibility. Maybe the Sea Peoples weren't the first domino, but the last, a final push that sent teetering civilizations crashing down. Their true impact might have been as accelerants, pouring fuel on fires that drought, famine, and political strife had already ignited. The most compelling evidence for this lies in what followed. After the Bronze Age collapse, the Mediterranean world rebuilt but differently. the Philistines in Canaan, the Sicilian tribes adopting Aegean-style pottery, even the Etruscans' mysterious origins in Italy, all hint at a cultural remixing born from mass movement. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy, they scattered pieces of broken civilizations across 3 continents where they took root and grew into something new. That's the paradox of their legacy. In unraveling the old order, they wove the threads of the next. Egyptian carvings at Medinet Habu offer a rare glimpse into the Sea Peoples' naval supremacy, not just through text but through vivid imagery. Their ships cut through the waves with sleek, predatory grace, their high prows carved into the heads of birds or beasts, designed to ride rough seas and ram enemy vessels. Unlike the bulky, cargo-laden galleys of Bronze Age kingdoms, these were lean warships built for one purpose, striking fast and vanishing. The reliefs show sails taut with wind, suggesting they could harness speed far beyond the laborious rowing of traditional navies. But the real innovation lay below deck. Archaeologists studying shipwrecks from this era found clues: reinforced hulls with mortise and tenon joints, a technique borrowed from Aegean shipwrights. This wasn't just raiding, it was naval engineering centuries ahead of its time. What set these ships apart wasn't just their design, but how they were used. The Sea Peoples didn't engage in set-piece naval battles like the Egyptians or Hittites. Instead, they attacked in wolf packs, swarming coastlines with terrifying coordination. At the ruined port of Ugarit, tablets describe attacks coming from multiple directions simultaneously, a tactic impossible without precise seamanship. Their vessels, shallow drafted to navigate rivers and estuaries, could strike far inland, bypassing fortified harbors entirely. Imagine a Mycenaean watchman spotting sails at dawn, only to realize too late that the raiders had already beached beyond the city walls. The psychological impact of this mobility can't be overstated. Coastal cities lived in perpetual dread, never knowing where the next attack might land. Egyptian inscriptions describe the Sea Peoples as moving like locusts, a metaphor that captures their unpredictability. Unlike land armies slowed by supply lines, their ships carried everything they needed: warriors, weapons, even families, allowing them to sustain campaigns across vast distances. A fleet could raid Cyprus for copper one month, then sack a Nile delta town the next, leaving no time for kingdoms to regroup. Yet their greatest advantage might have been their adaptability. When Ramses III finally defeated them at the Battle of the Delta, his artists documented a curious detail. Captured Sea Peoples' ships bore modifications, their prows lowered to mimic Egyptian vessels. This wasn't just imitation, it was evolution. Their tactics shifted with each encounter, borrowing from foes to stay one step ahead. By the time empires adjusted, the Sea Peoples had already rewritten the rules of naval warfare, leaving behind a legacy that would echo in the triremes of Greece and the longships of the Vikings. Their true weapon wasn't the sword, but the wave itself. The arrival of the Sea Peoples didn't just leave smoldering ruins in its wake, it reshaped the cultural DNA of entire regions. Take the Levant, where the Philistines, likely the Peliset of Egyptian records, established thriving city-states along the coast. Excavations at Ashkelon reveal a startling transformation. Layers of Canaanite pottery abruptly give way to ceramics with bold spiral motifs, their clay tempered with crushed shells, a technique straight from Aegean workshops. These weren't subtle imports, they were signatures of a new people. Even the humble cooking pot tells a story. Philistine, bell-shaped bowls with their wide mouths and carinated shoulders mimicked Mycenaean designs so precisely that archaeologists initially mistook them for imported goods. But these weren't trade items, they were the everyday wares of settlers who brought their culinary traditions with them, from how they stored grain to how they served wine. Weapons, too, carried cultural fingerprints. At Tel-es-Safi, the biblical Gath, blacksmiths forged iron daggers with curved hilts unlike anything in Canaanite arsenals. The metal itself was revolutionary ironworking, still rare in the late Bronze Age, may have been a Sea People's specialty honed during their migrations. Egyptian texts describe captured raiders with swords like flames, possibly referring to the gleaming, untarnished edges of iron blades, but the most telling artifacts are the hearths. In Philistine homes, excavators found circular clay ovens built into floors, their designs mirroring those in Mycenaean Greece. These weren't just functional, they were sacred. The central hearth, a gathering place for meals and stories, symbolized continuity with a lost homeland. Governance shifted just as dramatically. Unlike the centralized Canaanite kingdoms, Philistine cities like Gaza and Ashdod operated as a loose confederation, echoing the coalition-style attacks of their seafaring ancestors. Biblical accounts depict their rulers not as solitary kings but as seranim, a term possibly derived from the same root as tyrant in early Greek. This wasn't mere coincidence. The decentralized power structure, with each city-state maintaining its own army and trade ties, resembled the fractured political landscape of post-Mycenaean Greece. Even their gods bore traces of hybrid identity. At Ekron, inscriptions mention a deity named Pitije, whose name blends Semitic and Aegean linguistic elements, a divine mirror of the cultural fusion unfolding below. Yet the Sea People's greatest legacy might be what they absorbed. Over centuries, Philistine pottery grew less Aegean and more Levantine. Their gods acquired Canaanite epithets, and their language faded into the local dialect. A child's crater from Ashkelon, painted with birds and fish, shows this blend. The motifs are Mycenaean, but the vibrant colors are pure Canaanite. This cultural alchemy wasn't surrender, it was survival. By adapting, the descendants of raiders became farmers, merchants, and eventually part of the biblical tapestry. Their story reminds us that conquest isn't just about destruction. It's about the quiet, relentless work of rebuilding, one clay pot, one hearth, one generation at a time. The Sea People's final act is as enigmatic as their rise. After their cataclysmic raids across the Mediterranean, these shadowy warriors dissolve from historical records like mist under the midday sun. Egyptian inscriptions, our most detailed sources, fall silent about them following Ramses III's victories in the early 12th century BC. No triumphant epics chronicle their defeat, no mass graves bear witness to their annihilation, just an unsettling void where a civilization-shaking force once stood. This vanishing act fuels endless debate. Did they retreat to forgotten homelands, blend into the cultures they conquered, or meet some grim fate that history failed to document? Archaeology offers tantalizing but fragmented clues. Along the Levantine coast, where the Philistines, likely the Peliset subgroup, established thriving cities, we see cultural continuity rather than abrupt disappearance. Their distinct pottery styles and architectural traditions gradually fade over centuries, absorbed into Canaanite and later Israelite cultures. This suggests peaceful assimilation rather than violent eradication. Yet further west, the picture grows murkier. In Sardinia, the Nuragic civilization suddenly adopts new weapon types around this time. Bronze figurines wield swords eerily similar to those depicted in Egyptian reliefs of sea peoples. Could some have sailed beyond the Mediterranean's chaos, seeding their legacy in unexpected places? The silence of other conquered regions deepens the puzzle. Anatolia, once the Hittite heartland, shows no clear cultural fingerprints of Sea People's settlement after its collapse. If survivors lingered here, they left no distinctive pottery, no linguistic traces in later Luwian inscriptions. Similarly, the charred ruins of Mycenaean Greece reveal no influx of foreign artifacts post-destruction, just a centuries-long, dark age where even the memory of writing vanished. This uneven pattern hints that the Sea Peoples weren't a monolith but disparate groups who met divergent fates. Some rooted themselves in new lands, while others scattered like embers from a dying fire. Perhaps the most haunting possibility is that they became victims of the very chaos they unleashed. The systems collapse they accelerated drought, famine, the breakdown of trade networks would have made sustained conquest impossible. A warrior culture dependent on raiding prosperous cities would starve when those cities turned to ash. We see echoes of this in Egyptian records describing settled Sea Peoples mercenaries later turning against their employers during food shortages. Their greatest strength, mobility, may have become their fatal weakness when there were no more rich coasts left to plunder. The ultimate irony lies in their legacy. These raiders, who seemingly valued no culture but their own, became catalysts for cultural rebirth. The Philistine adoption of Canaanite gods, the Sardinian incorporation of Aegean motifs, even the Egyptian hiring of Sea Peoples as frontier guards, all speak to a paradoxical truth. By smashing the Bronze Age world, they forced societies to hybridize and innovate. Their disappearance wasn't an ending, but a metamorphosis. The Sea Peoples didn't vanish. They became the unseen currents shaping the next era, their DNA woven into the tapestry of civilizations that would one day birth classical antiquity. In the end, their most lasting conquest wasn't of cities, but of history itself. The story of the Sea Peoples isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror reflecting some of our most pressing modern fears. Picture a world where rising sea levels swallow coastal cities, where droughts force millions to abandon their homes, where once stable nations fracture under the weight of resource scarcity. These aren't just hypotheticals, they're unfolding realities, and the parallels to the Bronze Age collapse are unnervingly clear. Like the Sea Peoples, today's climate refugees often become both victims and vectors of chaos, displaced by forces beyond their control, yet blamed for the instability that follows. The Syrian civil war, for instance, was fueled in part by a years-long drought that drove rural farmers into overcrowded cities, straining social systems to the breaking point. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and the echoes between then and now are impossible to ignore. What makes the Sea People's story so resonant isn't just the destruction they caused, but the systems they exposed. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was a globalized world, its kingdoms interconnected by trade in tin, copper, and grain. When drought-choked harvests and piracy severed supply lines, that interdependence became a liability. Sound familiar? Modern supply chains, from microchips to wheat, are just as vulnerable. The 2021 blockage of the Suez Canal by a single stuck container ship cost the global economy billions per day, a stark reminder of how fragile our networks really are. The Sea Peoples didn't just attack cities, they exploited systemic weaknesses, much like how cyber attacks today target critical infrastructure. The lesson is timeless: complexity breeds vulnerability. Yet there's a crucial difference. The Bronze Age collapse plunged the Mediterranean into a centuries-long dark age, but humanity eventually rebuilt. Today, we have something our ancestors lacked: foreknowledge. Climate models can predict droughts, satellite networks track displacements, and historians have meticulously documented the mistakes of fallen empires. The Sea People's legacy isn't just a warning, it's a challenge. Will we heed the signs of strain in our own systems, or will we, like the Hittites and Mycenaeans, cling to business as usual until it's too late? Perhaps the most haunting parallel lies in the human element. The ox carts trailing behind Sea People's armies carried families, not conquerors but desperate people seeking survival. Modern migration crises from the Mediterranean to the U.S. border reveal the same heartbreaking calculus. When the choice is between certain death at home and possible death on the move, people will always choose the latter. The Bronze Age teaches us that no wall, no navy, no empire can withstand the tide of human desperation indefinitely. The only lasting solutions are the ones that address the roots of displacement before the storm reaches our shores. The Sea Peoples didn't just vanish, they transformed. Their descendants became farmers, traders, part of the fabric of new societies. That's the hopeful coda to their story. Collapse isn't the end, it's a brutal, painful rebirth. Our world, like theirs, will change. The question is whether we'll let that change break us or remake us. Because if 3,000 years of history have taught us anything, it's this: civilizations don't fall because of invaders or droughts alone. They fall when they stop adapting. And that's a lesson as urgent now as it was then. Hollywood loves a faceless villain swarming hordes descending on helpless civilizations, leaving only wreckage in their wake. The Sea Peoples have often been cast in this role, a nameless force of nature rather than a complex historical actor. But archaeology tells a different story. Egyptian carvings at Medinet Habu don't depict a uniform army, they list distinct groups: the Peliset, the Shurden, the Lucca, each with unique weapons, hairstyles, even ship designs. These weren't mindless barbarians, they were a coalition of cultures, possibly displaced by the same crises that toppled the Bronze Age world. Take the Shurden, often shown with horned helmets and round shields. Their armor appears in Egyptian art decades before the Sea Peoples' raids, suggesting they once served as mercenaries in Pharaoh's armies. The Lucca, meanwhile, are linked to coastal Anatolia and later Lycia, a people with deep roots in the region. Even the term Sea Peoples is misleading. Many likely traveled overland with ox carts, their families in tow. This diversity shatters the myth of a single, monolithic invader. Instead, we see a tapestry of desperate communities, each with their own reasons for joining this mass movement. The misconception of uniformity extends to their motives. Popular narratives paint them as conquerors, but evidence points to something more nuanced. At the Canaanite city of Ashkelon, Philistine settlements show careful urban planning, complete with imported Aegean-style pottery, signs of people building anew, not just pillaging. A Hittite tablet even mentions sea raiders negotiating for land, offering military service in exchange for territory. This wasn't mindless destruction. It was survival strategy, with tactics shifting from raids to diplomacy as circumstances demanded. Perhaps the most persistent myth is that the Sea Peoples erased cultures wholesale. In reality, they often absorbed and adapted. Philistine pottery gradually incorporated Canaanite designs, while their gods acquired Semitic names. Even their infamous iron weapons, once thought to be a technological secret, now appear to have been learned from Hittite refugees. The truth is messier and more human than the stereotype. These weren't demons from the deep, but people caught in history's undertow, reshaping the world even as it reshaped them. Understanding that complexity doesn't just correct the record, it reveals how civilizations truly rise, fall, and transform. Recent breakthroughs in DNA analysis are finally pulling back the curtain on one of history's greatest enigmas: the true origins of the Sea Peoples. At the Philistine archaeological site of Ashkelon, geneticists extracted ancient DNA from infant bones buried beneath centuries-old homes. The results sent shockwaves through the academic world. These children carried distinct genetic markers linking them to southern Europe, specifically to populations from Sardinia, the Aegean, and even the Iberian Peninsula. This wasn't just a cultural influence, it was a migration written in blood. Suddenly, those cryptic Egyptian names Peliset, Shurden, Denyen weren't just labels on temple walls. They were real people carrying the legacy of distant homelands as they crossed the Mediterranean in search of survival. But DNA isn't the only detective on this case. Isotope analysis, which traces chemical signatures in teeth and bones, reveals where individuals grew up based on the water they drank. At the wrecked city of Megiddo, skeletons from the Sea Peoples era show isotopic ratios inconsistent with local geology. Some match Anatolian water sources, others Cretan springs. This paints a picture not of a single invading army, but of a patchwork coalition, warriors, families, and craftsmen from collapsed civilizations, banding together in a desperate bid for new land. Perhaps the most startling discovery comes from Sardinia. Neuragic bronze figurines, long assumed to depict local warriors, now appear to show Sea Peoples' gear-feathered helmets, round shields, and swords identical to those in Egyptian reliefs. Even more compelling, Sardinian genetic studies reveal a sudden influx of Aegean ancestry right around the time the Bronze Age collapsed. Could some of these raiders have actually been returning to ancestral homelands after generations adrift? Meanwhile, underwater archaeology adds another layer. Off the coast of Turkey, a shipwreck dubbed the Ulubur Untu yielded not just trade goods but personal items: a seal with Cypro-Minoan script, a sword of Italian design, and amber beads from the Baltic. This wasn't a merchant vessel, it was a floating snapshot of the Sea Peoples' world where cultures and crises collided at sea. Yet for every answer, new questions emerge. Why do some Philistine sites show genetic continuity with earlier Canaanite populations, suggesting intermarriage rather than replacement? How did groups like the Lucca, historically tied to Anatolia, end up fighting alongside Aegean migrants? The truth may lie in the chaos of the collapse itself, a time when identity was fluid and survival meant reinvention. What's clear is this: the Sea Peoples weren't a single people at all, but a mosaic of the Mediterranean's shattered world. Their story is written not just in burned cities and sunken ships, but in the DNA of living descendants, proof that even history's most enigmatic invaders left traces in the very fabric of who we are today. The allure of the Sea Peoples has spawned theories as vast and turbulent as the Mediterranean itself. Among the most persistent is the idea linking them to Atlantis, a lost civilization described by Plato centuries after the Bronze Age collapsed. Proponents point to Plato's tale of a seafaring empire that vanished in a single day and night, drawing parallels to cities like Ugarit. But here's the problem: Plato's Atlantis was a philosophical allegory, not a historical account. The timeline doesn't align either. He placed Atlantis's fall 9,000 years before his own era, far predating the Sea Peoples. Archaeology offers no submerged metropolises matching his description, just the quiet ruins of real coastal towns swallowed by natural coastline shifts over millennia. Equally fantastical are claims of extraterrestrial involvement. Some theorists argue the Sea Peoples' sudden appearance and advanced naval tactics hint at otherworldly intervention. Yet Egyptian carvings depict their weapons and ships as innovative but undeniably human: bronze swords, linen armor, and vessels built with techniques traceable to Aegean and Anatolian workshops. The real mystery isn't their technology, but how displaced groups refined it under pressure. This wasn't alien ingenuity, it was human adaptation forged in the crucible of survival. Then there's the marauding horde myth, painting the Sea Peoples as a single, monolithic force sweeping across civilizations like a wildfire. Contemporary records dismantle this oversimplification. Egyptian inscriptions name distinct groups: the Shurden with their horned helmets, the feather-crowned Peliset, each with unique origins and likely competing agendas. The idea of a unified invasion crumbles under scrutiny. A Hittite tablet fragment even suggests some groups, like the Lucca, were already known as coastal raiders decades before the collapse, not outsiders appearing from nowhere. More seductive but equally flawed is the climate refugees as villains narrative. While drought and famine undoubtedly displaced populations, blaming the sea peoples exclusively ignores the complex interplay of factors. Mycenaean Greece's internal strife, Hittite succession crises, and Egypt's grain hoarding all contributed to the collapse. Reducing it to a single scapegoat is like blaming a spark for a forest fire while ignoring the tinder-dry conditions. The common thread in these debunked theories, they prioritize spectacle over substance. Atlantis and aliens offer easy answers, but archaeology demands patience. A single potsherd with Philistine spiral motifs tells us more than 1,000 speculative myths. When researchers at Ashkelon unearthed those infant bones with southern European DNA, they didn't just disprove wild theories, they honored the real human stories behind the legend. The sea peoples weren't supernatural destroyers or cosmic pawns. They were mothers, warriors, and craftsmen navigating a world unraveling at the seams. And that truth, messy, nuanced, and profoundly human, is far more compelling than any fantasy. The collapse of Bronze Age civilizations isn't just ancient history, it's a masterclass in the fragility of interconnected systems. Picture a world where kingdoms relied on each other for tin to forge bronze, grain to feed their armies, and diplomatic alliances to keep the peace. When one link in that chain snapped, the entire network unraveled with terrifying speed. The Hittites, for instance, depended on Egyptian grain shipments to survive droughts, while Mycenaean Greece needed Cypriot copper to arm its warriors. These weren't just trade relationships, they were lifelines, and when the sea peoples severed those lifelines, empires that had stood for centuries crumbled in years. The lesson: interdependence can be a strength until it becomes a vulnerability. Today's globalized supply chains, from microchips to pharmaceuticals, are just as delicate. A single disruption, like a pandemic or a blocked shipping lane, sends shockwaves across continents. The Bronze Age warns us, no civilization is an island. Resource mismanagement accelerated the collapse in ways that feel uncomfortably familiar. Tree rings from Anatolia tell a story of relentless drought, yet Hittite kings continued stockpiling grain for their armies while peasants starved. At Ugarit, clay tablets reveal frantic attempts to secure emergency copper shipments for weapons, even as the city's warehouses overflowed with luxury goods. Sound familiar? Modern parallels from water wars in drought-stricken regions to the hoarding of vaccines during global health crises suggest we haven't fully learned this lesson. The Bronze Age elites, like many today, prioritized short-term stability over long-term resilience. When the droughts came and the invaders arrived, their granaries and armories weren't enough. True security, the collapse teaches us, isn't just about stockpiling resources, it's about distributing them wisely and adapting before crisis hits. Yet the most profound lesson lies in resilience. After the fires burned out and the sea peoples moved on, something remarkable happened. From the ashes of Hattusa and Mycenae, new cultures emerged, smaller, leaner, and more adaptable. The Phoenicians, heirs to Ugarit's ruins, pioneered maritime trade routes that reconnected the Mediterranean. The Greeks, centuries later, rebuilt with decentralized city-states instead of top-heavy palaces. Even the Philistines, once feared as invaders, became farmers and artisans. Collapse, it turns out, isn't always the end. Sometimes it's a brutal reset. Modern societies facing climate change or political instability might take heart from this. The Bronze Age didn't just teach us how civilizations fall, it showed us how they rise again, often in forms their ancestors couldn't have imagined. Perhaps the ultimate takeaway is humility. The kings who ruled from Ugarit's ivory, adorned halls, or Mycenae's cyclopean walls never imagined their world could vanish. Their monuments proclaimed eternity, but their choices hoarding wealth, ignoring environmental stress, clinging to rigid hierarchies sowed the seeds of their undoing. Today, as we confront our own existential challenges, their story is a mirror. Will we heed the warnings etched in 3,000-year-old ruins, or will future archaeologists sift through our skyscrapers and smartphones, marveling at how another golden age forgot the past's hard-earned lessons? The Sea Peoples didn't just topple empires, they exposed the illusions of permanence that every civilization clings to, and that's a truth as urgent now as it was then. The mystery of the Sea Peoples is far from a closed chapter in history. It's a puzzle that grows richer with each technological breakthrough. Archaeologists now wield tools that would have seemed like science fiction just decades ago. Underwater drones glide through the Mediterranean's sunless depths, mapping shipwrecks invisible to human eyes. Off the coast of Turkey, one such drone recently revealed a previously unknown wreck near the famed Uluburun site, its cargo of copper ingots still stacked as if waiting for a buyer who never came. These robotic explorers are rewriting history without lifting a single trowel, uncovering trade routes disrupted by the Sea Peoples' raids and settlements lost to rising sea levels since the Bronze Age. But it's not just about finding artifacts anymore. It's about reading their hidden stories. Isotopic analysis, a technique that traces chemical signatures in bones and teeth, has become a game changer. When researchers examined skeletons from Ashkelon's Philistine cemetery, they discovered something astonishing. The teeth of older individuals carried isotopes matching the Aegean, while their grandchildren's teeth reflected local Levantine geology. This wasn't just migration, it was assimilation captured in biochemistry, proving the Sea Peoples didn't just conquer, they put down roots. Genetic sequencing adds another layer to the detective work. A groundbreaking study of ancient DNA from Sardinia found unexpected links to both the Eastern Mediterranean and the Iberian Peninsula, suggesting the Sea Peoples' movements were even more complex than temple reliefs imply. Meanwhile, linguists are applying AI to decipher fragmentary inscriptions from coastal ruins, searching for linguistic bridges between the names Egyptians recorded Peliset, Shurden, and known languages of the era. One tantalizing clue, the Philistine word for king, Seron, bears a striking resemblance to the Greek tyrannos, hinting at cultural exchange beneath the chaos of war. Even climate science is weighing in. By analyzing ancient pollen trapped in lakebed sediments, researchers have reconstructed drought patterns with startling precision. A core sample from Cyprus's Larnaca Salt Lake tells a grim story, a 50-year dry spell peaking around 1200 BC, exactly when civilizations began toppling like dominoes. This isn't just background context, it's motive. When the land can't feed its people, the sea becomes both escape and weapon. The most exciting developments come from interdisciplinary collaborations. Marine archaeologists teaming with astrophysicists have used stellar alignment data to recreate Bronze Age sailing routes, revealing how seasonal winds might have funneled Sea Peoples' ships toward vulnerable coasts. Chemists analyzing bronze weapons with portable X-ray devices can now trace tin ore sources, exposing broken trade networks that may have triggered desperate raids. Every field adds another piece, not to solve the mystery, but to deepen our understanding of how interconnected crises reshape human destiny. What emerges from all this innovation isn't a single answer, but a tapestry of possibilities. The Sea Peoples weren't just invaders or refugees, they were a symptom of a world in flux, a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of even the mightiest empires. As technology peels back layers of time, we're learning that their story isn't about endings but transformations, and that realization might be the most important discovery of all. The legend of the Sea Peoples didn't vanish with the ashes of Ugarit or the fading echoes of Hattusa. It embedded itself in the DNA of storytelling itself. Even in antiquity, their shadow loomed large. The Egyptians immortalized them as agents of divine retribution on temple walls, while centuries later, Greek historians like Herodotus wove fragments of their memory into tales of migratory tribes and lost kingdoms. But it's in the Hebrew Bible that their legacy takes on mythic proportions. The Philistines, likely descendants of the Peliset subgroup, became archetypal villains, Goliath's hulking figure standing not just against David, but against order itself. This wasn't mere historical record. It was cultural alchemy, transforming real raiders into symbols of chaos confronting righteousness. Fast forward to the modern era, and the Sea Peoples have become a Rorschach test for our collective anxieties. Victorian scholars, steeped in colonial fears of barbarian hordes, recast them as racialized marauders threatening civilization, a narrative that says more about 19th century prejudices than Bronze Age realities. Today, they resurface in video games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where they're depicted as a secretive cabal destabilizing empires, echoing contemporary conspiracy theories about shadowy global forces. Even climate change documentaries invoke their name, framing them as ancient parallels to modern displacement crises. What makes their stories so endlessly adaptable? Perhaps it's the haunting ambiguity at its core. Were they perpetrators or victims, destroyers or catalysts? That unresolved tension lets each generation project its own fears onto their enigmatic silhouette. Yet beyond metaphor, their tangible influence lingers in unexpected places. Take linguistics. The Philistine word for lord, Seren, may have seeped into Hebrew as Sar, meaning prince. In Sardinia, neuralgic towers stand as silent sentinels to a culture that possibly absorbed Sea Peoples refugees, their bronze figurines wielding swords identical to those in Egyptian reliefs. Even culinary traditions hint at their imprint. Archaeologists found Philistine kitchens stocked with Aegean-style cooking pots, suggesting recipes that crossed the Mediterranean with their makers. These aren't just artifacts, they're threads in a cultural tapestry woven through conquest and survival. The Sea Peoples' greatest legacy might be their role as history's ultimate disruptors. Their story resonates because it mirrors our deepest existential fears: the fragility of order, the specter of collapse, the uneasy line between outsider and invader. When modern writers depict apocalyptic scenarios or filmmakers imagine civilization's fall, they're channeling the same primal energy that once sent ox carts rolling across Anatolia and warships skimming the waves toward Egypt. But there's a quieter lesson here too. From the Philistine potter blending Mycenaean spirals with Canaanite clay to the Sardinian smith forging Aegean-inspired bronze, their story reminds us that destruction and creation are two sides of the same coin. The Sea Peoples didn't just leave ruins in their wake, they left a blueprint for how cultures endure, adapt, and ultimately transform. And in an era of global upheaval, that may be their most enduring gift. Now it's your turn to play historian. The mystery of the Sea Peoples is like an ancient jigsaw puzzle. Half the pieces are missing, and the ones we have could fit together in countless ways. Could these enigmatic raiders have been proto-Vikings, mastering the seas centuries before the Norse longships? Their naval tactics, lightning-fast strikes, shallow drafted ships, and coastal raids do mirror later Viking strategies. Or were they refugees from a forgotten civilization, like the hypothetical Aegean Atlantis some theorists dream of. Imagine a thriving island culture swallowed by earthquakes or rising seas, its survivors taking to the waves with vengeance in their hearts. Then there's the economic angle. What if the sea peoples weren't invaders at all, but desperate merchants turned warlords? The collapse of the tin trade essential for bronze would have left entire fleets of seafaring traders jobless and starving. Faced with ruin, might they have banded together to seize resources by force? We see hints of this in the cargo of the Uluburan wreck, a floating bazaar of goods from a dozen cultures. Could that ship have belonged to a trader turned raider, his livelihood sunk by drought and collapsing empires? But let's flip the script entirely. What if the sea peoples were the ancient world's version of a mercenary army? Egyptian records mention the Sherdans serving as elite bodyguards decades before their appearance among the enemy coalition. Maybe these weren't mindless destroyers, but hired swords who switched sides when pay dried up. Picture a Bronze Age Blackwater, their loyalty tied to gold and grain rather than kings or homelands. Here's where you come in. Down in the comments, hit us with your wildest or most scholarly theories. Maybe you think DNA evidence will one day trace them to a specific island chain, or that undiscovered shipwrecks hold the key to their origins. Could they have been early Etruscans, or even distant cousins of the Celts? The beauty of this mystery is that every fresh perspective adds another layer to the story. So channel your inner Indiana Jones. Sometimes the boldest theories lead to the most groundbreaking discoveries. After all, it was once considered crazy to suggest the Philistines came from the Aegean. Until science proved it true, your idea might be the next piece of the puzzle. The sea peoples remain history's ultimate enigma, a blur of movement and violence glimpsed through the smoke of collapsing empires. They left no grand monuments boasting of their deeds, no epic poems singing their triumphs. Just whispers in clay and stone, scattered like shards from a shattered vase. Yet their fingerprints are everywhere, in the ashes of Ugarit's ruined docks, where merchants once haggled over Cypriot copper and Cretan saffron. In the eerie silence of Hattus's abandoned archives, where Hittite laws etched in cuneiform were left mid-sentence, even in the DNA of modern Sardinians, carrying traces of Aegean ancestry like a faded tattoo. These weren't just raiders, they were the storm that rewrote the map of civilization itself. What makes their story so endlessly compelling isn't just the mystery of their origins, it's the mirror they hold up to our own world. Their era saw climate change choke harvests, trade networks snap under strain, and societies fracture under the weight of inequality. Sound familiar? The parallels between their collapsing Bronze Age and our unstable modern era are too stark to ignore. But here's the crucial difference: we have their example as a warning. When archaeologists sift through the ruins of Megiddo or Thebes, they're not just uncovering ancient history, they're reading a survival manual for civilizations on the brink. The search for answers continues with tools our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Underwater drones mapping forgotten shipwrecks off the Lycian coast. Laboratories extracting millennia-old DNA from tooth enamel and bone. Satellite imagery revealing drought patterns in long-vanished river valleys. Each discovery peels back another layer of the mystery, showing us not just who the sea peoples were, but how societies transform under pressure. Maybe we'll never know if they hailed from Sardinia or Sicily, if they were pirates or refugees or something in between. But their legacy isn't in the gaps of our knowledge, it's in the undeniable truth they revealed. No civilization, no matter how mighty, is immune to the tides of change. So what comes next? The story isn't over. Every year, new technologies give us fresh ways to interrogate the past. Maybe a shipwreck will surface with cargo that rewrites our understanding of Bronze Age trade routes. perhaps a buried tablet will finally name their homeland. Or possibly, just possibly, we'll learn to see their story not as a riddle to be solved, but as a lesson to be remembered, because the Sea Peoples didn't just vanish into history. They became part of it, woven into the DNA of every culture that rose from the ashes they left behind. Their greatest legacy might be the humility they teach us, the understanding that even the grandest empires are but temporary shapes in the sand, waiting for the next tide. If this journey through the shadows of history has gripped you, don't let it end here. Smash that like button to help others discover these untold stories. Subscribe to keep unraveling history's greatest mysteries with us, and drop your wildest Sea Peoples theories in the comments. Who knows, your idea might just be the missing piece that helps solve a puzzle 3,000 years in the making. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the past isn't dead. It's not even past.